Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. So again, my name is Elliot Offit. I'm our VP of Implementation and Onboarding at Forma.ai, and I will be moderating the session for us all here today. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to Nabil to introduce himself, and then Mike, and then we'll jump into our topics for today.
Sounds great. Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Christina. Excited to be here. So my background is I'm the founder and CEO of Forma.ai. I've been in sales comp for the majority of my career, and I think that this is a very excited to dive into today's topic and in the session, given the difference that you'd expect and wouldn't expect to see from sales leaders versus comp leaders. And so excited to be here today.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. My name is Mike Duda. I run our solutions engineering team here at Forma. I've spent the last 13 years of my career in go-to-market strategy and sales operations. Recently, before Forma, I ran our global sales operations team at Qualys. And I like to describe sales comp was my Achilles heel during that time. So very excited to have the discussion with you all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Okay, well, let's just jump into it. So a little bit of background on what's going on here. So we surveyed over 100 top revenue and sales comp leaders in late 2023 to understand how they feel about best practices for sales comp design and rollout. So we reviewed the data and found there are some areas where the two groups agree. So we'll get to those. And of course, there are some areas where they disagree. So today we'll talk through some of these areas. And within the next 2 weeks, we're going to share the full report with all of you who are attending our session today. So throughout the event, we'll run a few polls. So please pay attention. Be ready to click on those. We'll just leave them open, for a minute or two to get results, and then we can see how the audience compares to what we got through these two different groups of leaders. So with all that being said, quick comment, just restate. Feel free to put Q&A in. We'll go through the different questions and the results first, and then with time permitting, we'll get through some of the Q&A as well. So first topic is basically planning for your comp plan design process. So here's the results. I'll let everybody take a look at that and absorb it. But let me go ahead and I'll have Mike respond to this one first. So the question, of course, on the screen, how long should the sales comp design process take at an enterprise organization? So Mike, you want to share a few thoughts?
Yeah, so I thought the results on this were pretty interesting. On one hand, 50% of revenue leaders thought that comp design should take less than a month, with another 40% stating 1 to 2 months, whereas comp leaders said 1 to 2 months and 50% said 2 to 3 months. And, when I think about these results are different, I think there's just different perspectives based on their job function. So, on one hand, you have sales leaders that come from a perspective of keeping the comp plan simple so reps can understand how they're getting paid, which should take less than a month from a design perspective. And then, comp teams believe it should take more time because they want to ensure changes won't be made to comp plan mechanics throughout the year, because that requires a lot of changes to be made to systems and process, which can be very difficult to implement on a short notice, given the complexity in an enterprise organization. And when you really start to kind of peel the onion back on that complexity, first you have the complexity in aggregating historical data that you need to use to properly financial model different incentive plans. Then you need to gather tech requirements in order to build it into the system. Then you build plans into a staging environment. Then you need to test it. Then you need to build it in production. So anytime there's changes that occur from territory changes or quotas or new roles, pricing, product launches, it takes a lot of time to go back to that step. So I think, a lot of the results are more centered around the fact that comp leaders want to spend more of that time up front to really think through that design piece and anticipate potential changes, so there isn't a lot of rework later at a later time.
Yeah, I agree fully with that. I think there's an interesting element of accountability, right? Revenue leaders are accountable to the number. And so their goal is to pivot the sales organization as fast as possible. So that any delay in that is actually seen as a negative in their eyes. And the risk of not hitting the number exceeds the noise and the pain that's going to come from a bad rollout whether it's the financial implications of the business or a misalignment or inaccuracy for the reps. And then to your point, Mike, on the comp leader side, we own the responsibility of getting it accurate. You own the responsibility of delivering on a process that's fiscally responsible. And so I think, again, where the accountability lies is kind of where you're seeing the weighting, because naturally it's going to over-index on doing the right process, going through all the checks and balances from a comp perspective and the revenue perspective on speed. So I think that it just speaks to the difference in where accountability sits, and then furthermore, what needs to happen to execute.
Yep, definitely data shows us that revenue leaders expect things a little faster, which doesn't surprise me at all. Just having worked with both groups of stakeholders tend to want things to move along more quickly.
And by the way, I mean, like, I want to call it, I don't think from all my experience and kind of every sales comp leader that I've talked to, I think the customer is the sales reps and the sales team, and it is delivering the numbers. So I don't want to state that there's a misalignment there. It's purely the comp leaders, like, we have to recognize all the checks and balances that need to get done. And so I think just naturally the burden that gets neglected is quite common. But at the end of the day, I think everyone's aligned to move as fast as possible. It's just that the ownership of the consequences of moving too fast, if you don't have the process and systems in place, is not felt as much by the revenue leaders versus comp leaders.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so second question in this area is how often should comp plans, or let me read it from the slide, so repeat language, how often should you adjust your comp plan based on actual spend and effectiveness data?
Yeah, I think so I think this one's interesting too, and there's some disagreement on the percentage. So 60% or more of revenue operations and revenue leaders think that you should be adjusting the comp plan twice a year or more, compared to only 30% of comp leaders. So if I'm thinking about these results from a sales perspective and kind of the mindset from a sales lens, is that sales is working deep in the trenches with prospective customers. They're seeing firsthand where potential changes need to be made to better incentivize reps, which may not have been captured during the strategic planning process. And, for example, let's just say a sales leader identifies that, hey, 3-year ramp deals are working better to close new logos, and that wasn't built into the original plan. If you don't adjust the comp plan, you might miss on a potential opportunity to increase win rates because reps aren't incentivized for that specific deal structure. And where I think comp leaders are coming from is that they're working deep in the trenches, configuring the systems, running change management, ensuring variable comp is paid accurately and on time. So I think they're coming from a place of execution, and where any changes could negatively impact that execution, and where revenue leaders want to make more iterative changes based on customer feedback throughout the sales process during the year.
All right. Well, I'll pass to Nabil here. You got us on mute, but I do just echo real quick. I like that the point about execution makes a lot of sense, Mike. That you got to get things right, and changes sometimes can lead to mistakes. And so I can see a level of it's actually a little bit of conservatism and not wanting to make many changes from the rev leader's perspective. It's an interesting observation. But Nabil, have some thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar to question number one, and kind of that gap between the ownership and accountability, and to Mike and your point here on, like, the execution ownership is through comp leaders' lens, and seeing the pain. I think in my mind, the aspect here is we all know that comp plan needs to change when it actually makes sense to the business is when it should change. Now, that threshold of when does it actually make sense to change comp relative to, I think, not even just the execution burden or the execution hurdle, but also the hurdle of change management, educating the sales team, right? I think one of the interesting things is comp is one of those topics that no one wants to talk about. And so, you roll out the comp plans, and then even revenue leaders sales managers don't continue talking about comp with their sales team after the first week or 2 weeks of the year. It's like, okay, we get it out, and then like I don't want to talk about it because it's comp, sensitive topic. And so in my mind, I think is on the comp side, what you see reps that come halfway through the year, 8 months in the year, not fully understanding their comp plans. And so you truly appreciate the element of there's a change burden, the change management burden of enablement and education. And so the comp plan needs to change when it's the right time to change. And sometimes in that case, you have to cross that hurdle of all the effort that needs to go in change management, enabling the sales organization, which again, I think owning that part of the execution and seeing that on the comp side is naturally going to sway sway this response closer to the annual cycle versus midway through the cycle as the revenue leaders indicate. But
yeah, I mean, I do think, Nabil, you're hitting on, like, obviously you want to do it when it's right for the business. And part of what I read into it is a little bit of like revenue leaders are going to tend to have the closest pulse on how things are working with their field sellers, and probably have more confidence that, hey, when I think it's actually time to make a change, we want to make the change. So a little bit of bias towards maybe the biannual, like more frequent change versus, this is my assumption, is that the comp leaders probably have done more analytics behind what went into the plan for the year, and therefore are more comfortable letting it kind of play out a bit more and getting more data in the moment than responding to what to them may feel like more of a knee-jerk reaction. That's kind of how I read these two answers, because they're not vastly different, but clearly the comp leaders are a little more conservative around making change, and a revenue leader who would move a little more quickly. But yeah, interesting difference in perspective. And I don't think there's a wrong answer here. It's ultimately, can you figure out what's right for the business and act on that, as you said. Cool. Well, with that being said, so hopefully everybody out there is paying attention. Christina's going to open up a poll for us now, and we'll get the insights from the group here that's on the call. So I'm going to go to the tab, see what happens. Okay. All right, got answers coming in yet? Probably shouldn't. I won't open it as early next time, because now we're going to have biased answers coming in here, I suspect. So my apologies.
And I mean, yeah, just to be clear, I think there's an element of one part that we didn't really touch on and cover is this is somewhat business, specific. And I think if your business is changing and is projected to see a lot more chaos, and chaos is maybe not the right word here, but in the coming year or 2 years, I mean, arguably, you may want to shift proactively to a shorter period of measurement, right? Whether it's biannually or even having quarterly targets. I think there's a point that came up in the chat here around not making structural changes throughout the year because of the rat's nest that is legal change management, et cetera. And I certainly agree fully with that statement. I think are there circumstances where changing it does make sense? Yes, but again, it only makes sense if it crosses the hurdle of all the legal hoops and loops you have to go through, the enablement and the change management and the cost of making that change. And I think rarely is it it has to make a lot of sense before that actually crosses that threshold.
Okay, well, it seems like our results are roughly aligned. More biased towards annual here. I don't have the profiles of what kind of participants we have, if it's used more towards the comp leader than rev leader, but yeah, not too far off here. Okay, so thanks for participating there, everybody. We'll go ahead and jump to kind of our second bucket area, which is around plan rollout. So the first question here is, what is the biggest bottleneck to launching new comp plans and quotas on time? So again, Mike, you want to take a first pass at this one?
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever seen a comp plan launch on time in the last 13 years. So I'd say there's multiple bottlenecks, which cause comp plans and quotas to be delayed, but I think there's probably three main ones. First, I'd say go-to-market planning and strategy and execution are done in silos, which creates major delays. You have one function that's responsible for designing the actual go-to-market strategy, which translates into creating territories, then creating quotas, and then designing the actual comp plan. And then on the execution side, like I said earlier, you need to gather tech requirements for the new incentive plan, build the plans into some sort of staging environment based on whatever system that you're using, test all the plans are working properly. But all those steps are done by different functions and teams, and that causes a lot of delays. I'd say the second thing is there's multiple different tools used in large organizations throughout the same process that I just described. So those disparate systems, or if we're using Excel for more of a point solution in certain areas, makes it really challenging to create a single source of truth for all of your sales planning and compensation data. And then third thing, which I think gets overlooked a lot, is creating policies that need to be rolled out along with quotas and compensation. So, there could be leave of absences. If you're covering another rep's territory, how does out of territory get credited? How does splits work? I mean, the list kind of goes on and on with a bunch of those second and third level questions, right? And there are a lot of questions that come up in larger, more complex organizations. And if those policies aren't clearly documented and communicated to the field, that can also create a lot of delays. So I think those are the three big buckets.
All right. Excellent. Nabil, you had some other thoughts to share?
Yeah, I agree with those statements. I think the one thing that'd be interesting here is maybe as we kind of continue doing and expanding on this research in the future, is to get a better sense of how this differs for comp leaders that have a center of excellence for sales comp that spans globally and kind of sits across different departments versus ones that are a bit more siloed. And I say this because I think stakeholder management is a very difficult challenge in sales comp, right? It effectively touches almost every department, from, the products that we sell to HR or legal, finance, and the sales organization. And then of course the upstream data, so IT, and you think about all the different stakeholders that need to get alignment. And so to me, the key here is how do you think about implementing process frameworks so that decisions that are made are not made from scratch every single time, but rather follow these kind of guided frameworks of decision making to kind of streamline all the respective stakeholders within this process. And I think to really, where from our experience and kind of where we see that work very well is when it is a single owner of sales comp process, design, and execution across the entire organization, because they can bring that framework into that sales comp center of excellence type of organizational structure. So I think, stepping back, it would be interesting to dive deeper into that in our future studies to just get a sense of a further deeper dig into this data.
Yeah, that's interesting because you said it a little differently than how I thought about this when I saw this result. But the assumption I made when I saw this was that stakeholder alignment, we know is hard. We see it in certainly large organizations when we're working with them on compensation solutions, but a lot of times there's not really good data or analytics that have been done. And so you have different people trying to advocate for a direction and a decision in a lot of ambiguity. Inevitably, there's going to be some of that ambiguity, but the more analytics you can do in running different scenarios on potential plans and see those outcomes, I think that is likely one of the solutions to at least shortening the time it takes to get alignment. But it kind of goes to your point, Nabil, that it would be interesting to know organizations that have a very refined center of excellence around this versus those who are trying to do it much more ad hoc. Does this dynamic change a lot when you have good data and analytics to look at? Does stakeholder alignment become less of a significant issue? But certainly interesting. Certainly agreement from both of our stakeholder groups here on what the biggest bottleneck tends to be. So awesome. Okay, let's jump to the next question we had in this topic around plan rollout. So the question, I'll go ahead and read it. I think Christina's pulling it up. Yeah. when is the ideal time to share the new comp plans with the sales organization? Again, Mike, stick with you want to go first?
Yeah. So I personally firmly believe that comp plans should be in the hands of sellers within the first month of your new fiscal year, which is either before or during SKO. And I think everyone on this, the results kind of speak for themselves, where a lot of people would agree with that sentiment. The worst scenario would be to have this awesome new comp plan that could drive the behaviors you're looking for, and reps are demotivated for the first quarter or more because they never received their plan. So, again, the results don't surprise me. 90% of both revenue leaders and comp leaders tend to agree with this. So,
yeah, I see both sides of the equation here, because I have, it's a firsthand experience being at an SKO where, and when we say SKO, it's a great question. So like a sales kickoff, so different terminology for different businesses, but effectively that kind of kickoff to the year for the sales organization. And I've seen it where that kickoff occurs, and the only thing that's being talked about is the comp plan change. And it detracts from all the messaging we want to have on new process, new product launches, etc. So to me, this is not an immediate. I think where the parts I agree with you, Mike, are absolutely you want to minimize disruption in the sales motivation, and you want to get the plan understood by the reps as fast as possible. So ideally, you start the new year, you know exactly what your incentives are, and to me, there's a you go in, to Mike's point here in the comments. I think, you go into the SKO, you have a clear understanding of what you're going to do. And I mean, by the way, here's an interesting tactic, concept. How many of our reps and sellers have pipeline at the end of the fiscal year that bleeds into the next fiscal year? Almost every seller is going to have pipeline that bleeds in. I mean, even no matter how fast your sales cycle is. And so why do we create this disruption at the beginning of the year? It takes away from it. The caveat I would say is, if you are making a drastic shift to comp plans that aligns with a go-to-market shift that you want to communicate as a part of your SKO, then I actually think in some cases, waiting until the SKO or after SKO actually drives a better impact, because you want to tell the narrative of the change. And sometimes that's just better told when you have all the pieces of information in person with the core selling team and bringing the right stakeholders to deliver that message. So I don't think it's a clear answer. I mean, yes, ideal is to have incentives out as fast as possible, but there are some caveats that I would say as an exception.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that, Nabil. Kind of the amount of change could be, because I was thinking about the same thing when I saw the results, very similar, but what might drive you to one end or the other of this? And I think, kind of to Mike's original point, like when the plan's going to be relatively easily understood, it's not big change from prior yet. As soon as possible makes a lot of sense. Just get it out and let everybody know what they're executing against. But at the same time, to your point, Nabil, if there's a lot of organizational big sales org changes happening, territory restructuring or whatever it might be, new roles being introduced, it could make sense to let some of that settle, get communicated out, and then, okay, now here's how you're going to get paid within this new operating model that's been pushed out to the team. So yeah, makes a lot of sense. So Christina, do you want to go ahead and launch for us? I think she's out there. We're going to do a poll on this one now. I think she's got it. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some, there's seems to be common consensus to use that SKO to talk about the comp and the process. I think one of the things that organizations, and I've seen this, especially on the sales side, really shy away from, again, talking about comp. No one wants to talk about it, even though it's one of the biggest drivers of sales performance. And then two is quota setting. And that part is interesting, because the more sophisticated your quota setting process is, and the more variables in the data that you use, the more scientific, the more accurate, and the less biased it is, but the harder it is to explain. And I think, again, organizations shy away from that complexity because, it just adds that much bigger of a hurdle for educating the team. But SKO is a perfect time to do that. So it actually, again, it aligns very well if you are kind of increasing the sophistication of the quota setting process. On the other hand, if you don't do it right and you don't communicate it and you do it at SKO, it could be a really big distraction. So it's kind of on both sides.
Yeah, I think there's a comment in there in the chat, kind of along those lines. Fair point.
Yeah, and then the other comment in the chat, actually, it depends when SKO is. That spot on as well. I mean, if it's typically later in the first quarter, it kind of adds an incremental cost to not having the comp plans out versus, if it's at the very beginning of the year, really compelling.
Just stated our assumptions. I think our assumption was SKO is really definitely within that first month of the year, likely the first part of the first month of your fiscal.
Yeah.
Fairly typical. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So those are our first two topic areas. Let's jump to the third and last here. It looks like we'll probably have a little time for Q&A as well after we run through this section. So now we're going to talk a little bit about post rollout after you've launched the plans. So the first question here is, when is the best time to survey your reps to gauge satisfaction with the comp plan? All right. And Mike, we'll go to you.
Yeah. So I think in general, this is a great best practice that many organizations don't adopt. And so I personally believe that this should happen while you're designing the next comp plan, in my opinion. And when you think about this, just like you would interview customers, if you're designing a new product for feedback, I believe you should be incorporating that same feedback into the compensation design process and speaking with different sellers, understanding motivations, challenges, and incorporating that into the design process. I think, too often than not, we're relying on leadership feedback and financial inputs as the main inputs into the comp design process. And that if we included that sales feedback before rolling out new comp plans, I think it would achieve some better outcomes.
Nabil?
Yeah. I mean, I think again, this is an interesting one. For me, because I think, Mike, I agree. I mean, you want that feedback as fast as possible. I mean, you want the plan to be engaging. I mean, the interesting thing is we all know that a survey is going to produce one result, but are there other metrics that kind of give you the power of a survey, but the actual what's happening on the street? And I think there's an element of are we as comp leaders tracking and measuring the behaviors that we're intended to be driven through the comp plan and seeing how that maps to the survey that we're running with our sales organization. And they're satisfied with this part of the plan, but actually the behavior that we're intending to drive is not actually being driven. It's tells us even more. I think about the timing of kind of the survey to gauge the satisfaction. I think sooner is better. And this goes back to, I think, this gap of not wanting to talk about comp. You see, the comp team talks about comp every time we interact with sales. That's what you do. Whereas revenue leaders, I actually feel like the comp plan gets rolled out and we see this firsthand. It's like, it's just, there's so many other things to talk about tactically. Where's the pipeline? Where are all the things? It's a part of the conversation, not the conversation. And so us wanting to get feedback sooner on the comp side, it really speaks speaks to that. I would say this should not be a one and done either. Like, it's not a just within the first quarter and that's it. I think that there's an ongoing mechanism for feedback. And I think, quite a few, the sales comp leaders that we've had on the sales compensation show and the podcast have kind of like resonated and repeated that that important feedback of opening the gateway and the door to feedback from the sales organization is so critical. And I think for us, it's, maybe simpler, smaller surveys, but happening more frequently.
Yeah. And I probably took a slightly different look at this when I saw the results at clearly the revenue leaders seem to bias a little bit more towards doing it earlier, like first half of the year, really, or even right after it's rolled out or within that first quarter, versus the comp leaders that kind of slightly biased towards later half of the year or right before you start your next planning cycle. But one thought I had was that, of course, you could do both, and that's probably the right way to do it. But if you're only going to survey once in a year, I think you're going to get slightly different information. Like if you do it early, you're going to get more around the reaction to the plan and maybe how well it was understood. If you do it late, it's going to be biased, I suspect, towards how do people do on the plan. And then the satisfaction is going to be different later in the year versus earlier in the year. So I think there's an element of like, what are you trying to learn? Is it mostly to feed the next planning cycle, or what's the primary objective, if you will? Interesting point here. Absolutely. I'm not suggesting this is the only way to get feedback. Certainly different ways to do this. So I'm reading some of the responses as they come in. Yeah.
I think Meredith's point is spot on. I think like there's a, to echo actually Dal and Meredith's point kind of go hand in hand. It's like you roll out a survey early on, you're asking how people feel. I mean, it's exactly the response that we're going to get. It's not fair. It's not equitable. But that partly is because they may not understand how it's going to actually impact them, which is, back to the point of you can ask a survey, but are there behaviors, predictions in actual sales activity that we're not going to compensate on, but we recognize, hey, this new incentive structure, this new metric is actually meant to drive this specific type of behavior. It's pipeline build with this type of ICP, selling this product mix. And so do we start to see that uplift within the first quarter? And if not, then we know that the incentive perhaps is not working. But I also think the definition of a survey is pretty broad here. What are we actually asking the sales organization? Because in my mind, it's common that you see a survey go out that is, how do you feel about this plan? Or do you understand this plan mechanic? Rather than actually asking a survey that's very pointed. What are you going to do? Like prioritize the top 5 things that you are going to do. And you actually give them those 5 things to maximize your comp this year. And let's see if the reps actually align the behaviors with what truly the comp plan is actually measuring and driving. And I think that tells you a lot more about the reps. I would say satisfaction. It's almost the understanding of the plan, which ties directly with their satisfaction of knowing that they're going to make the money. So.
All right.
Yeah, I'd call out Steven's comment. Was pretty interesting. Using a panel of top reps that have been nominated by their senior leader, and think of like the 80-20 rule, right? 20% of your reps probably generate 80% of the revenue. So I thought that was a great call out. So.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I'm looking at a few of the comments, and so we've got a number of questions in here too. Feel free to put questions in Q&A, and we'll get to that pretty quickly. Got one more of our polled questions, and then we'll do our last poll of the group. Then we'll get on to Q&A. So go ahead. Yeah, you got it up here, Christina. So the next question we're going to talk about is, should a sales rep's understanding of the compensation plan be formally tested? So in my mind, it's kind of like the certifications. A lot of times reps get certified in different pitches and presentations. Like, should they effectively be certified on understanding the compensation plan? So again, Mike, we'll take it to you first.
Yeah. So my first reaction to this question was no, because I'm so used to enabling the plan from an enablement perspective. And I think that's enough. But, the more I thought about this in practical execution of rolling out plans, either sales operations or sales enablement, maybe even someone on the comp team typically sets up training sessions with each region, walks them through how the comp plan works. And usually there aren't many questions during those calls, and everyone's feeling good about the plan, or so you think. And then the first payroll cycle runs on the new plan, and all of a sudden there's hundreds of questions or disputes on how they were paid. And a lot of those questions are related to simply not understanding how the actual comp plan works. Some are valid, but I'd say 50% or more most times are more just understanding how the comp plan works. So it's not something I've personally done, but it was an interesting question because I think it could actually be useful if used correctly. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is just to dive in here. I think this to me is very telling of kind of where the pain is felt. The amount of disputes and inquiries that come in because the sellers don't understand how they're being incentivized. I mean, clearly comp leaders are pushing for, okay, we do need to formally test and make sure that people understand their comp plan. And then, obviously, again, the accountability of I want revenue. So more revenue leaders, this was actually the surprising for me, was that more revenue leaders, like the majority, 54%, said yes. By the way, I think a question earlier around the size and scale, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 100 is the mix.
And I was going to mention just on that one, when we send out the full results, we'll give you a good set of, I think we've got the list of, I don't have it right in front of me, but like the titles of people who participated. And so you'll have a good flavor of who actually contributed to create this data.
But yeah, I mean, I think this is, to me, even the revenue leaders being kind of leaning towards this is very telling. I mean, the comment that we had internally, like when we were discussing the analogy is, when you go, and I don't know how it is, I'm pretty sure it's very aligned to the US, but in Canada, when you get your first driver's license at 16, it's a written test. You can't drive a car on your own, but certainly you have to have at least a confirmation that you understand the rules of the road before you can even get in the car with someone who, that's going to help train you and coach you. And I think, to me, this is an interesting element is this is one of the largest investment vehicles that we have in the go-to-market organization. Do we not want to validate that our sellers actually understand how they're being motivated and what they need to do to be successful? Like, this should be and this goes back to kind of the survey question of like, what do you need to do, the top 5 things, and prioritize them. And if a rep doesn't fully get that, I mean, like, that's not a takeaway from the rep. It's actually just, again, we want every rep to pass this test. We want every rep to be successful, but it's a good forcing function for the sales comp team to enable the sellers. And I think it's just about shifting the revenue leaders' perception of this is actually really important, that, getting an organization to buy into this. And I mean, Stephen, I couldn't agree more with your statement of good luck getting reps to complete this. Yeah. And this is why it has to be a top-down function. It has to be driven from the top to say, we're, as a part of sales kickoff, you have to pass an understanding of, just like you have to be certified on sales process and the tools that you use in sales. This is, I think, one of them that needs to be well understood and as a part of rollout.
Yep. I mean, I think in my head, I basically agree with the output here. There's more yeses than nos for sure. So I was kind of trying to think through, why might you say no in this case? I think the point around, you just might have a hard time getting people to actually do it. So you'd have to figure out the right motivation there to get it done. But in my mind, one question is just around like the culture of the organization. And I think that doing it, if you haven't done anything like this before, could be a good way to send a signal to get a little bit more attention just on the plan, even if people aren't completing it. Talking and awareness that, hey, there's this kind of checking in your knowledge of the plan could be valuable. The one cultural element where I would say no is maybe if you're trying to fix some things, you've had issues in the sales org, maybe there's not a lot of trust in the comp team, you've had problems with comp, like just one more thing to throw at them might be a bad idea. That was kind of how I took this one, that there could be cultural reasons on both sides of this that you strongly bias towards one or the other answer here. So I think it's definitely one of those sort of consultant. It depends on the state of your org and what makes sense if you do something like this or not, and how.
Yes, 100%. And the execution on this is critical. I mean, like, I think Stephen's the latest comment here from Stephen is spot on. I mean, there are certain elements of this that you can't just incorporate legally in certain jurisdictions, and I think there's an element here of if it's not enforced at a higher level, it's more of a, you need to do this. Now, you may not withhold commissions, but you recognize that there's an expectation set in the business. But certainly how it's rolled out and does it make sense? It may not, right? It also, you have to think about is how big of a drastic shift is this? Maybe your comp plans. I think there was a comment that was made much earlier around comp plans may not necessarily need to change for years, which is 100% spot on, right? Like if the structure is working, if it's driving the right behavior, that why take on any disruption cost? And so there's an element here of even this might not be a formally required thing if you implement something like this on an annual basis, but rather only when a significant comp plan change occurs, as an example.
Or new people, right? Just making sure new hires understand the program. Okay, awesome. Well, that was our last question that we had queued up here. We'll go ahead and launch the last poll and get some input from the participants.
Neck and neck.
Yeah.
So we got a fewer votes than last time. So I don't know if we lost people if they're not putting them in. At least on the first one, I was kind of noting the count is higher. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
This is definitely more of a contrarian, I think philosophy, and definitely would have a lot of friction internally to make happen. But it's interesting as we expand these studies and the cohorts that are involved. I know these studies take some time, but there's a lot of value in kind of the aggregation of some of this data. And one metric for me that would be a very good measure of something like this, and for those that are involved, that are interested in being involved, certainly something that we can share it after, but would be any sort of sales performance data in Q1 and the timing of and kind of that measurement of activity and sales performance in Q1 relative to time of launch of a plan, and then correspondingly the understanding of the plan and whether things like this are employed. Because I think this is one where it's a very high friction and it costs to implement, but the underlying cost or the ROI of doing it could actually be quite high. It's just, it's very difficult to measure and difficult to do so within just one organization. I think that's is something that be interesting to see.
Okay, well, we've got a handful of questions here in the Q&A. I was just starting to go through them here. Some of them we've already addressed. Let's see, find one here that makes sense to discuss. All right. Okay, we didn't really talk about this one much at all. How strongly should seller feedback influence comp plan changes? It's a good question. Let you guys think about it for a second. My take is definitely should influence. Ideally, that feedback is gathered early. And where I see this playing out is like if there's a direction with the comp plan changes, assume we're talking about changes in the next update to the plans, that is pretty like diametrically opposed, like to the feedback that's been received from the field. It should obviously give you a lot of pause if we should make the change. But I don't know what other people think here, but I suspect from a group of people who are kind of comp leaders, they're going to take all that feedback with a grain of salt. So how strongly, I think it sort of depends on, I guess the point of my answer is how directly in opposition to a change you're making is some of that feedback that you've collected. Otherwise, it's probably not like the most critical input versus just your analytics on your business and your forward-looking strategy. But I don't know, Nabil or Mike, if either of you guys have comments on that one. How's the question? How strongly should seller feedback influence comp plan changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the type of feedback, right? If the feedback is a misunderstanding of the plan, misunderstanding the plan logic, the component, the essence of what we're trying to motivate, I think that feedback is very, very important to take into consideration because it feeds directly into your enablement. If there is feedback on the level, how motivating that component or structure is, I think, there's an element of, sample bias because you're really, you're going to hear very, very loud vocal voices from people that feel negatively about it. So you have to, almost get a sense of where is that measurement coming from? And I think the stronger the noise or the stronger the signal is, aka the more of the sellers that are kind of echoing similar feedback on the motivation level of a component, the more seriously you have to take it. And then the third kind of category that I would think about is there a sales process disconnect with the incentive that we've rolled out? And that, even a little bit of noise, is something that should be investigated. Because if there's a process in the sales motion that is going to create a negative, a negative outcome or a negative impact on the ability for a seller to actually earn that incentive, or the way that the crediting logic is configured makes it difficult for reps to understand, I think we need to get that input early, especially when making bigger changes, so that we can align the go-to-market motion with the incentives that we're looking to drive. So I think it's kind of those three categories, and factoring in this, the strength of the signal that we're receiving in each.
Mike, anything on that one, or want me to go?
Yeah, no, I'd echo Bill's point. I just add that unless there's a very clear business reason to make a change to the plan based on seller feedback, I lean towards not changing it. You always have spiffs that you can run if you recognize that, hey, we might have not captured something in the actual compensation plan. You can always leverage spiffs to drive incentives. I just think because of the implementation complexity to make changes, sometimes there's more at risk than there is to gain. So unless there's a pretty compelling business reason to change, I'd say to keep the plan as original.
Okay, let me jump to another one here. So this one has to do with alignment, quota setting. So the question that came in: what are some hot tips for improving the alignment of quota setting teams with comp planning teams? So getting comp rules reflected in quotas. Okay. I think the short answer is you have to be able to do the right analytics, right? When territories are updated, to be able to set quotas fairly on new territory design. If I'm understanding that, well, comp planning teams, I'm rolling territories into comp planning teams. To get at the heart of it.
So this is this one is an interesting one because it really depends on the quota setting methodology that's used. And the more sophisticated the quota setting methodology, the more it needs to be looped in with the comp design process. And so I'll give you an example. Simplest form of quota setting, you take your top line number, you figure out what the growth rate is, and then you just take the bottom number and do a bottom build up at a territory level by applying that growth rate. Very complex quota setting methodology where you're leveraging a number of weighted attributes, potentialization scoring at an account or prospect level to dynamically create quotas at a territory or an individual account level. The importance there of having that alignment and on the extreme end is very high, because in order for us to understand the financial impact, obviously the financial impact of a change to accounts or territories mid-cycle, understanding any sort of overrides or adjustments, depends on us understanding the mechanics and attributes of what feeds into the quota setting process. Okay, so just setting that as a preface, I know that's not the question that's asked, but specifically tips on improving this process. I think recognizing the value, typically finance is a very close partner in quota setting, because they, at the end of the day, need to budget and track and work with the teams that own quota setting. But they also work very closely with the teams that own comp, because we need to set the budgets and the financial cost of it. And so creating a recognition that the closer that these two are aligned increases quota accuracy, forecasting accuracy of accruals and budgets, is probably the best business case for, forcing the organization or pushing the organization to bring these two things together. And I think that's probably, one of the biggest tips that I push for is kind of the angle of the ultimately, the more accurate we are with our accruals, the more that we can spend on incentives to drive better behaviors and stay within the original budget that was set. I don't know if there's if there's anything else that the group here has seen. Feel free to share. Obviously, this is kind of one where for those that have brought these two things together, I think that's tactical experience. But
cool. Okay, well, kind of winding down on time here. I know AI is a topic that you like to talk about, Nabil. So we've got one question that came in around AI. So what are some of the early success stories of AI innovation in sales comp, and is a design admin somewhere else also what a success actually look like?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so this is obviously a topic that's very near and dear to me, but I think you have to step back and think about what good. So, I mean, if you think about AI, the first element in the first area that I thought it was relevant to was the design of sales comp. And it is absolutely relevant to design of sales comp. But what good is leveraging AI to optimize sales comp design if it takes you 4 to 6 months to implement any change? And so I think the core part is, how do you think about AI? AI is an enablement platform. I mean, from day one, when we started the company, we used to joke, artificial intelligence, until we have sentient AI, which is so far away, there's nothing, it's not actually artificial intelligence. It's augmenting intelligence. It's augmenting the human to do more faster. And, to me, the element of enabling organizations to move faster by taking away the repetitive work is ultimately the biggest driver of value add. So the pace and how quickly you can make change is an immediate step up in terms of enabling you to do more and more analysis upfront to getting there. The second part is in forecasting. So even before you get to design, leveraging AI to do and support the quota setting process. I mean, setting the right metric and understanding what good performance looks like is the most important step in any sort of incentive plan. And I think that ultimately is the second element. There is another question that kind of ties to this. And Tony, when you talk about understanding benchmarks, the industry benchmarks across the board, I think this is one of the biggest gaps in this industry. Because to date, when we think about benchmarks, we don't have a common language of sales comp, right? Every organization is building their sales comp process from scratch using a custom-built data engineering pipeline. So I can't actually take one set of data that's truly at an incentive level from one company and balance it out and benchmark it against another without a massive amount of human lift to understand what that data means. And I think this goes back to the AI piece. If you automate and you're automating the repetitive work, the configuration, the tactical elements, what you're actually doing is creating a consistent language for sales comp across the board. And that's where we're going to start to see some really cool benchmarks. In the coming years, I think what we today look at benchmarks kind of at aggregate level, quota distribution curves, pay mix distribution. We are going to start to look at benchmarks at a tactical incentive level. Do these types of incentives drive better or worse behavior in large ACV deals, long sales cycles, et cetera, versus smaller organizations selling to smaller businesses? And I think, I echo this, and it's a common theme that I hear from many sales leaders and ultimately investors in late stage companies is, I think what's happening to sales right now over the next 5 to 10 years is what occurred with marketing organizations over the last 15 years, which is there's more data in marketing over the last 15 years, where today the marketing leaders and the way that marketing operates is actually far more data driven than it is, gut and feel. And I think sales is going that same direction. We have activity data, we have call recordings. Every single interaction with our customers is being tracked and using that data as a part of the sales comp process. And so I think this kind of, again, this is what excites me about this whole space of sales comp is being the biggest lever of spend. We hold the biggest budget to that data-driven approach to managing sales teams. And I think, it's just only going to elevate the function more and more over time. So I think that's kind of my long-winded answer on that.
Yeah, awesome. No, thanks, Nabil. And we're about time to wrap up. So and I don't see too much more coming in on the Q&A. I'm trying to bounce Q&A to chat back and forth here. But why don't we just end it on that? A good topic to end on. Certainly one I know you're very passionate about, Nabil. So first, thanks everybody for joining the session today. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we're going to launch the full report. So for those of you who registered for this, you will get a copy of that here the next couple of weeks. We just got to get it polished up and ready to present to you. And then if you stay on for 1 second, we're going to put a link in the chat here for you to go. If you want to just go ahead and register, we're doing another event on April 16th. And so it's a 2-part series about measuring comp plan effectiveness. So we'll just stay on for a sec. So you click on chat there, scroll to the bottom. Christina posted it. So you've got the link. You can click through and hopefully register for that event. And we'll see some or many of you there, hopefully. But with that, I guess we'll wrap it for today. Thanks everybody for all the engagement in the chat and the questions that came through. So hope everybody has a great holiday weekend here coming up.